On behalf of the faculty of Northwest Nazarene University, I'd like to welcome you to the second of our 4 lectures and the part of our Centennial Series Faculty Award Lecture. Just to remind you, Kevin Timpey was our first speaker, and he spoke on the subject of transformation. Tonight, of course, is Dr. Pete Crabb. We'll talk about that momentarily. Joe Gorman will speak on service, and Julie Straight will be speaking on community. And those lectures will take place in April and September of next fall. The schedule for the evening is really quite simple and straightforward. After some brief remarks, I'll present our lecturer who will give his address. If time is available, the speaker will then take some questions. And at the conclusion of our meeting, we'll have time to greet the lecturer outside in the lobby for a brief reception. You know, we gather in moments like these to celebrate the life of the mind and of the spirit. The NNU Faculty Lecture Award provides a forum for faculty members of the university to present to the Academy the results of their scholarship. And while NNU is primarily a teaching institution, its mission encourages and prizes faculty and student scholarship. All university faculty have a critical role in contributing to the sum of human knowledge and understanding. Faculty at Christian universities have a particularly important role in this process. As Christian academics, it's our role to join in the academic critique of the patterns of scholarship, behavior, discovery, and art in the world around us. If we have done our job well, not only will our scholarly activity achieve some measure of acclaim, we will imbricate the dialogue with a motivational ethic that is expressly Christian. As a university which finds its worldview in the gospel of Jesus Christ, we believe that the truth of the gospel and the truth of the social and physical sciences, the arts and humanities, the underpinning theology are all ultimately in harmony with one another. As Christian academicians, the search for knowledge and wisdom and their application to our lives and the lives of our students and to our society is central to our calling. So tonight, we have an opportunity to see one of those minds at work and to experience a scholar addressing a topic that is of great concern to him. You know, the choice of our lecturer tonight was pretty competitive. It was a selection process. It was selected from a wide variety of applications on a number of topics. Early in the spring, several faculty members interested in giving the lecture were invited to submit their applications, and the Faculty Development Committee, which is chaired by Dr. Ben Earwicker, went through those applications one by one. As I watched that committee go through its process, I was selected with the care and commitment to excellence they demonstrated in their discussion. This year, there were several impressive applications, and the selection process was not easy by any means. The committee then recommended to me their choice for the Faculty Award Lecturers for this centennial year. The second lecturer is Dr. Peter Crabb, and we're very pleased to have you here, Pete. Pete is a professor of business in the School of Business here at Northwest Nazarene University. A special emphasis on economics, and that's what Pete will be talking to us about. Professor Crabb received his bachelor's degree in supply chain management and operations management from Michigan State University. I was just about to say that. I really was. Even though I was raised a Michigan guy, it's okay. I have a sister who went to the dark side. He has his master's degree in business administration from the University of Colorado, a Master of Science in Economics, and a Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Oregon. Tonight, Dr. Crabb will be speaking on the value of truth as he presents the crazy idea of a Christian libertarian economist. Thanks, Pete. It's good to have you with us.
Great to be here. Thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to talk about this. This is a subject of interest, of passion of mine, and the opportunity to speak on a topic that blends a lot of my different areas of learning here. But I was a little nervous when I looked at the headlines this morning. Today's Wall Street Journal has the headline which reads, "There is a yawning need for professors in boredom studies." My students in macroeconomics this afternoon thought, Bring them to NNU. That's exactly what they said. And so I'm worried about who's in the back row, that they might be actually researching boredom on the part. Yeah, perhaps. But I'll try not to bore you. In fact, I'll promise not to put up a single graph. So for all of you that have had economics, there will be no graphs. I am excited to be part of this Centennial lecture, though. Dr. Webb said the selection process was tough, and I see that the selection process has brought some great scholars for you in this series. Kevin last fall did a tremendous job. He set the bar very high for me. I was sitting right about there watching his lecture, and he had so much material, and he had so many books. They were about this high, if you remember, and he went through many of them during his lecture. And I said, wow, he's really set the bar high for me. But I beat him. I have 1,000 books with me, and I've read them all, or perhaps at least parts of all. Most of them are from the 19th century about classical liberalism, which I'll be talking about tonight. My lecture is couched in the idea of a Christian college, Arthur Holmes' famous book. In it, we learn that Christian colleges are distinct from other institutions of higher education because Christian scholars actively integrate not only faith and learning, but also faith and culture. In this presentation, I will show you how I pursue both immigrations. My Christian faith and my philosophy of political choices influenced my study and teaching of economics, as well as my interaction with the culture. A Christian libertarian economist is a scholar who has not only integrated their faith with learning, but has also explored how faith impacts everyday economic decisions and political choices. Many would see these three positions in conflict, but a Christian can be an economist can be a libertarian, and a libertarian can be a Christian. I've got three parts to my talk tonight. First, I'll briefly discuss why it is so unusual to hear about a libertarian economist. While it might be not unusual to hear economists or libertarians, Christian libertarian economists are outside the norm. Second, I'll look at three political philosophies that influence economic decisions, or the philosophy of political economy. And then last, I'll apply those philosophies to some fundamental principles of economics using libertarian and Christian ethics. My thesis is pretty simple. A libertarian political philosophy applied to economics is consistent with a Christian worldview. But before I begin the defense of that thesis, let me put the discussion in the context of our Centennial Series here. This lecture is an area of scholarship that is somewhat new to me. Until very recently, my scholarly work was strictly empirical and really in the area of discovery, to think of Boyer's model. I welcomed this opportunity when I saw the applications to demonstrate theoretical and applied scholarship as well from a Christian worldview. Specifically, how my Christian worldview and teaching at a Christian university has formed and expanded my understanding of political economy. The content of my lecture is related to the university value of truth. The statement of truth by the institution reads, "We believe education pursues truth, and NNU explores knowledge, the wonder of God's creative activity, the story of human civilization, and the achievements in the arts, sciences, and professions. Ultimately, we believe Jesus is the truth incarnate, therefore we pursue Christ." So NNU believes education is the pursuit of truth. Mine is just one such story. My study of scholarly work in economics allows me to pursue the truth of not only this discipline, but also theology, philosophy, political science, and others. Scientist Edward Tuff was recently quoted as saying, "The world is much more interesting than any one discipline." I have certainly learned this to be true while teaching. I'm thankful to NNU in this respect. I'm thankful to teaching at a Christian liberal arts school. because we can pursue truth. I'm very thankful for Dr. Alexander for making me aware of Dallas Willard's work in the Veritas Forum at the University of Harvard. He said this about the institution. The university today distances itself from truth and backs away from knowledge into research. Next, socially certified research methods are allowed to determine which areas of thought and talk can possibly count as acceptable opinion and academic practice, and what might count as knowledge of truth. There are no knowledge universities now in the Western world, but everywhere there are research universities. I would tell Dr. Willard there is a knowledge university. It's right here at NNU. And what we're doing as part of this series is all part of that. So again, my thesis, a libertarian political philosophy applied to economics is consistent with a Christian worldview. It's a crazy idea to think of a Christian liberal economist. We are a rare breed. But this is not because economists are not usually libertarian. Writing recently in the New York Times, Harvard economist N. Gregory Mankiw said, economists are receptive to the concept of immigration partly because they tend to have a libertarian streak. Economists look to free markets to lead, as they are the best outcomes for society, and the question of immigration's impact on the labor market is no different. Just like all libertarians today, the founder of modern economic study, Adam Smith, is known for his support of free markets and his opposition to government intervention. 200 years after Smith, those teaching economics today still look first to the market for the solution to any social issue. If a problem persists, we then look for another solution. Well, what is crazy, or at least somewhat crazy, is an economist or a libertarian with a Christian worldview. Beginning with the Christian economists, we do find a group of Christian scholars that study economics, but said group is rather small. The Association of Christian Economists, for example, has roughly 400 members, but the American Economic Association has over 18,000. While there are others out there, few economists directly pledge their faith to the discipline or pursue a course of research that actively integrates their Christian faith or worldview. Now, it gets even crazier when you start to think of a Christian libertarian. Writing in 1979, Austrian school economist Murray Rothbard said, "It is true that many, if not most, libertarians at the present time are atheists. This remains true 2 decades or more later." According to some more recent writers, like Jason Brennan of Georgetown University, few libertarians today have any faith at all. Most would be considered agnostic or at best deist. What today's libertarians should know, however, is that the movement was founded primarily by Christian philosophers. As Rothbard also noted, among the classical liberal forebearers of modern libertarian in a more religious age, there were a myriad of Christians, from John Locke in the 17th century to Frederick Bastiat and the great Lord Acton. As such, I argue that a Christian libertarian is just getting back to his or her roots. But before making such arguments, let me outline the 3 main political philosophies that influence economic decisions and policies. These philosophies influence consumer decisions. They influence business decisions of various types of markets. They influence public policy choices, such as the redistribution of income and taxation. This is just to name a few. I will follow the review with an application to specific economic principles. The 3 main philosophies are utilitarianism, liberalism, and libertarianism. Begin with utilitarianism, and most associated with Jeremy Bentham. It's the political philosophy according to which the government should choose policies that will maximize what economists call total utility. That's our fancy saying for happiness. We like to measure utils, as economists say. How many utils did you experience today? So a utilitarian will look at total utils, or total utility, this theoretical measure of happiness or satisfaction. Jeremy Bentham was followed by his student John Stuart Mill. And Bentham wrote an essay, A Fragment of Government, that it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. So Bentham and Mill were positing that the greatest happiness principle should guide our social decisions and our structure of government. It's based, in part at least, on the idea of human nature's preference for pleasure over pain. My students don't have any trouble experiencing that one and understanding that phrase. So, in economic terms, this utility measure will find itself most in pleasure. But it will also follow an economic principle called the law of diminishing marginal returns. That is, as a person's happiness rises, the extra satisfaction from an additional unit, or marginal utility as we would say, of whatever created the pleasure will decline. The utils will increase, but at a decreasing rate. So utilitarian philosophy suggests that the well-off aren't as happy with the next dollar of income, as an example, as they were with the first. In contrast, an extra dollar of income to the poor would provide a tremendous amount of utility. The policies that come out of such thinking include the ability to pay principle for taxation. This is what guides our progressive tax systems, like the income tax system in the United States and in Idaho. So when discussing how wealth or income might be distributed, or distributive justice, a utilitarian usually makes the case for redistributing income from the well-off to the least advantaged in society. But they do not believe that all incomes should be equal. They realize that people respond to incentives, one of the key principles in economics. And if incomes or wealth was to be all equalized, this would reduce the incentive to produce more wealth, to work harder. So they accept the historical facts refuting the social philosophy of egalitarianism. Communism have been unsuccessful. If individuals do not work as hard, total income falls, lowering total utility. Thus, in a utilitarian's opinion, the government must balance the gains from greater equality against the losses from distorted incentives. We have a progressive tax system, but we can't have a too progressive tax system. So that brings me to the second of the three philosophies, modern liberalism. This is the political philosophy according to which the government should choose policies deemed to be just as evaluated by an impartial observer behind a veil of ignorance. This veil of ignorance ideas is attributed to John Rawls in his famous Theory of Justice book from the 1970s. He argues that it's only the utility of the least advantaged in society that matters. He finds that justice is served when we are most concerned about being at the bottom of the income or wealth distribution. He wrote, social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged, consistent with the just savings principle, and attached to offices and positions open to all conditions of fair equality of opportunity. Thus, distributive justice, in Rawlsian terms, is served when public policy raises the welfare of the worst off person in society. In an application in economics, this becomes what is called the maxi-min criterion, or the claim that a good society will maximize the well-being of the worst off person. Income redistribution is necessary under such a philosophy. But economists don't see rational individuals behaving as Rawls predicted. If we assume all outcomes to be equally likely, but we just don't know where we're going to fall in that ladder or distribution, we would try to maximize average utility. We're equally likely to end up rich as we are poor, so we would want to average or maximize the average. This is really just the utilitarian philosophy that I presented a minute ago. So economists really see these two philosophies as one and the same, utilitarianism and modern liberalism. So that brings me then to the final branch of political philosophy that is directly related to economic issues, that is, libertarianism. Modern libertarianism finds its source in the writings of economist Murray Rothbard, who I noted earlier, and perhaps more widely in the academy from the writings of Robert Nozick. He wrote in his book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, published in 1974, he wrote the book partially in response to Rawls's earlier theory of justice. And he argued against the application of liberalism and utilitarian principles to the question of distributive justice. He saw any redistribution itself as unjust. Nozick showed that resources or wealth aren't initially distributed by anyone. They don't come from behind a veil of ignorance. And they are there because of the resources that were granted to us, whether intangible or tangible. Resources could also be gathered or created by us, by individuals, who then exchange them for other resources. But when the state does this, when the state redistributes resources, income, or wealth, it violates individual rights. This is the connection between modern libertarianism and classical liberalism, the category where I would put myself. One other group of libertarians today sees no role for government at all. Anarchists, or anarcho-libertarians, as John DeMasi has called them, say people can protect their own rights. But the larger group of today's libertarians will argue that by forming a constitutional government, like we have in the state of Idaho and in the United States, that is based on rights, the people are doing just that, protecting their own rights. So this branch of libertarianism is referred to as classical liberalism and is associated primarily with Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman. He said the consistent liberal is not an anarchist. I would take this a step further, and that's essentially what I'm doing with you tonight, to say that the Christian committed to the liberal arts is also not an anarchist, but is committed to the protection of individual rights. The same rights that Nozick was concerned with are what classical liberal writers had mentioned early on. John Locke identified the natural rights. First, that everyone is entitled to live once they are created. Second, that everyone is entitled to do anything they want, so long as it doesn't conflict with the first right. And third, everyone is entitled to own all they create or gain through voluntary exchange, so long as it doesn't conflict with the first two rights. From these rights, classical liberalism or libertarianism finds the only role of government to be the protection of rights. Again, addressing this question of economic distribution of wealth. Classical liberalism calls for government action to punish crimes and enforce voluntary contracts, but not the redistribution of income. Libertarians realize that society itself earns no income. Only individual members of society earn income. There is a violation of natural rights or justice when the government takes income from some individuals and gives it to others to achieve any particular distribution of income, equal or otherwise. So libertarians conclude that equality of opportunities is more important than equality of incomes. We believe that the government should enforce individual rights to ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity to make the most of his or her talents and achieve success. Government should show no partiality, just as we learn in Leviticus as well as James, both the Old and the New Testament. Further, when government does show partiality, it must coerce others in society in order to accomplish such actions. This involves aggression, which libertarians find immoral and unjust. David Boaz of the Cato Institute explains here.
What is libertarianism? Well, we might say it's the presumption of liberty in human affairs. That is, sometimes we may need government to act, but you have to demonstrate that. You have to make the case for government action. It's the exercise of power, not the exercise of freedom, that requires justification.
Libertarians argue that we don't have to justify our positions as individuals. Government has to justify their actions. Again, if people are forming government to protect their rights, that government has to justify any action it takes for that protection, not the other way around. And most often, the government has to act aggressively so as to enforce the laws that it creates. And that's what brings Christians to libertarianism and classical liberalism. Norman Horn, the founder and editor of LibertarianChristians.com, there he is, writes that the core of libertarianism is the non-aggression principle, that the initiation of force against a person and property is immoral, and it is in many respects a kind of political corollary to the Golden Rule. Economist Henry Hazlitt says that what is called the private sector is in fact the voluntary sector, and what is called the public sector is in fact the coercive sector. And that's why Boaz would say they have to justify that coercion. Markets that rely on voluntary cooperation and not government assistance, by such standing, have a higher moral standing. They hold the higher moral ground over government. So the classical liberal economist and author of the free market mantra, the invisible hand. You'll never find an economist with invisible hands, or one hand, because we always have to say on the other hand. So I don't know where Smith thought we might have invisible hands. But he was not a theologian, but was a moralist. He understood this moral high ground of the markets. His most famous text is The Wealth of Nations, but he also wrote on ethics. In the theory of moral sentiments, Smith shows how freedom, particularly economic freedom, cultivates morality within individuals. Free markets bring together one's opportunity for moral and material growth. And only by participating in free markets and engaging voluntarily do we increase both our material and our moral well-being. Again, David Boaz, who you just heard from, in his book Libertarianism, a Primer, argues that libertarian finds its roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition, when Jesus claimed that we should render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. He divided the world into two realms, making it clear that, as Boaz says, not all of life is under the control of the state. This was a radical notion at the time and has remained part of Western Christianity since. So what was true then is also true today. There are other Christian economists out there in Nazarene schools. Bob Roller, dean of the Jenner School of Business at Mount Vernon Nazarene, is one such thinker. He says that the thoughts of libertarians, like Friedrich Hayek, are consistent with a Christian worldview. Commenting on Hayek's book, Roller writes that the individualism that provides the foundation for free markets has Christian roots. With free markets, the fallen nature of people tends to work for the good of both the individual and society. That is, greed is harnessed for good. But Christians and non-Christian economists alike know that the idea of greed directing people's action is not necessary for well-functioning markets. It's not a necessary or sufficient condition, as we like to say in economic theory. The motivations behind economic actors can be many. Economist Israel Kirzner writes, what drives free markets is not necessarily greed at all. It is the purposefulness, of potential entrepreneurs whose purposes in the disposition of their pure profits may be altruistic, selfish, or whatever. The motivation isn't necessary for the market to work well. So Jacqueline Otto of the American Enterprise Institute has summed up well the thoughts and beliefs of a Christian libertarian. 4 fundamental principles. Christian libertarians are libertarians first because they are Christian. Just as our value statement says, they first pursued Christ, and then the truth of political economy found in libertarianism. They accepted the political ideology after and as a consequence of accepting Jesus as their Savior. Second, the individualism of libertarianism appeals to Christians because their own salvation was an individual choice. This was certainly true for me. Jesus died that all may be reconciled to God, but he did not do so corporately. We must accept God's gift of salvation. Third, while Christians believe that social engagement is an imperative of the faith, it cannot be coerced. Back to the non-aggression principle. As the Apostle Paul said, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. Fourth, a Christian libertarian believes strongly in Christ's message of liberty. Jesus said, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. To be free, we must have the ability to own our choices. We have freedom in salvation to accept Jesus as Lord, or go our own way. For Christian libertarians, society must do the same. Encourage choices and not separate those choices from their consequences. So that is the political theory of the Christian Libertarian Economist. But it wasn't enough for me that libertarianism lines up well with Christian ideas of freedom and Jesus' principles. For me, I needed to see the principles at work. As I mentioned earlier, I'm primarily an empirical economist. I needed to see the data, or at least someone had to demonstrate it for me that it was true. Libertarianism has not only lined up with the virtues of my Christian faith, it has been shown to work. That is, it has virtues itself. So to this question, I now turn with a review of 3 fundamental principles of economics that are consistent with Christian libertarian political philosophy. There are other principles out there, but again, I don't want to be that study in boring professors going through all of them. If you want me to go through all of them with you, you can sign up for my macroeconomics class. We do spend an entire week on this subject. Harvard economist N. Gregory Mencken identified 10 fundamental principles in his best-selling economics textbook. All major textbooks have a similar list. These principles come from hundreds of years of economic theory and have proven themselves in the data. In my years of teaching these principles, I have found they also align well with the ideas of a Christian libertarian. Let me review and make that connection with just 3 of the 10. Come to that one. There, I was on the right page already. His 5th principle states that trade can make everyone better off. Voluntary trade in free markets is not like a sporting event where one side gains from another's loss. In fact, trade will not occur in free markets unless both sides stand to gain. We all benefit from trade. We do not generally build our own homes, make our own clothes, or grow our own food. We trade for all these things. Just as with individuals, different societies benefit from trading with one another. International trade allows for specialization in products that countries have an advantage in, that they are best at creating. Thus, trade helps everyone use the gifts that they have and reach the potential that their Creator has bestowed upon them. Perhaps the most famous parable about this is the story of the pencil from Leonard Read, the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education. He wrote about the incredible miracles that such a system creates, and said that since only God can make a tree, I insist that only God could make me being the pencil. Man can no more direct these millions of know-hows that bring me about into being than he can put molecules together to create a tree. Reed was so overwhelmed by the power of market but from just looking at a pencil. Imagine how he would have felt at looking at what many of you are carrying and have right in front of you tonight, the so-called smartphone. Would Reed have been amazed at the power of trade and specialization that we see today? I think he would. The Institute of Faith and Economics in Washington has won awards for that video production. The Miracle of the Smartphone, a play on Reed's original ideas with the pencil. I think he would have been amazed by the magic of today's markets. The magic that free trade, that cooperation, that the markets bring us, all of this technology. So like Reed, Christian libertarian economists marvel at what free markets can do for everyone. Economists at the Fraser Institute in Canada have studied economic freedom over the past 2 decades. And they have found that the link between economic freedom and growth is significant. In their World Annual Report for 2012, liberty in the markets is what is needed for individuals to raise their standard of living. According to the authors, economic freedom means people are free to choose, trade, compete, invest, and have the fruits of their labor protected against aggressors within a legal framework of equal treatment and minimal interference from government. The link between economic freedom and long-term prosperity is overwhelming, just as overwhelming as the technology in the smartphone. Freer economies invest more, grow more rapidly, and achieve higher income levels than those that are less free. So the Christian libertarian supports capitalism and free markets because they work. But some Christians argue that the government has to help those that are hurt when businesses fail. Some even argue that the government should not allow businesses to fail because of the harm that it may do to some workers or other members of society. But as R.J. Moeller of the American Enterprise Institute explains, Christians often feel too uncomfortable about talking about the consequences of bad economic decisions, just as they feel uncomfortable telling people that they could go to hell. He writes that bad business ventures should fail. Lazy employees should be fired because actions have consequences. But also, good business ventures should succeed. Hardworking employees should be promoted. Good investments should make money. That is capitalism. And capitalism without bankruptcy is like Christianity without hell. For the Christian libertarian, the market is also the best way to serve the poor. Father Robert Sirico of the Acton Institute says that there will always be the need for charity, just as Jesus always told us that the poor would always be with us. But one thing that is absolutely proven to raise people out of poverty isn't charity or aid at all. It's the free market. And especially businesses that call on the capacities of the poor to create wealth instead of addressing only their needs. I'll talk a little bit more about that from my own research in a little bit. Mackew's sixth principle states that the markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. Note that Mackew says usually. Countries that once had centrally planned economies have abandoned this system in favor of market economies. The fact that Google's president made a trip to North Korea is an illustration that communism is finally being abandoned. These centrally planned economies failed because they did not allow the market to work. A market economy allocates resources through decentralized decision-making of many firms and households as they interact in the marketplace. Market prices from these interactions reflect both the value of the product to the consumer and the cost of the resources used to produce it. The political theory of classical liberalism and the historical evidence show that when a government interferes in this process and prevents prices from adjusting, household and firm decisions become distorted and markets might fail. Adam Smith's invisible hand will only work if the government enforces property rights. Markets will fail when individuals lose the ability to own and exercise control over their resources. So Mankiw argues that such failure will occur for two broad reasons: market power and externalities. The problem of externality is when the well-being of a bystander is affected by my actions. The problem of externalities, however, can be resolved through the judicial system, not by government regulations or spenders. So both Joel and Bill aren't here, but yes, Christian libertarians like lawyers. The judicial system works. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Ronald Coase showed this. When governments protect property rights, externalities will be small or non-existent. He was addressing what is called the problem of social costs. And he showed that even though there may be an impact of one person's actions on the well-being of a bystander, such externalities will only persist if the transaction costs over negotiating these problems is very high. Thus, the government has a role in keeping negotiating costs between you and I low, and must have an efficient judicial system. Coase showed that if transaction costs are low, the market process itself will bring about an outcome irrespective of the assignments of property rights. In other words, we can handle our own disagreements. So consistent with a Christian libertarian economic approach, Coase thought that government intervention beyond the basic protection of property rights would create more problems than it solves. He said, the assumption that governments always do the right thing is not true. They make lots of errors. And where they are most likely to make errors can be found by studying how governments operate. And I've had a lot of experience, he says. I worked for the British government for many years, and I saw how decisions are made. And stupidity is very common. The second possibility for market failure, according to Mankiw, is monopoly power. But monopoly power most often comes from the government itself. Economist Milton Friedman, again Nobel Prize winner, wrote that when market power does arise, there is only one choice among three evils: private, unregulated monopoly, private monopoly, regulated by the state, and government operation. The least of these evils is private, unregulated monopoly. Friedman's work shows that the competitive market will eliminate the market power of private monopolies over time. So the Christian libertarian economist doesn't worry about the problem of monopoly power. The voluntary actions of individuals making decisions in decentralized markets is a much more powerful force than any government action. As Coase thinks, when government tries to restrict monopoly power, when they try to restrict monopoly power, stupidity is once again more common. So that brings me to the third of Mankiw's 10 principles that I want to cover from a Christian libertarian standpoint. Principle number 8 from Mankiw states that our standard of living depends on our ability to produce goods and services. Gross domestic product per capita, our major measure of our standard of living, differs widely across countries, and the changes in the standard of living over time can be great. The explanation for these differences lies in the differences in productivity, or output per hour of labor worked. High productivity implies high economic growth and a better standard of living. Governments that interfere with the ability of individuals and the businesses that they work for will lower productivity and retard economic growth. The evidence for Mankiw's 8th principle can be found in What Everyone Should Know About Economics and Prosperity, written by economists G.W. Gwartney and Richard Stroop, who said that free market economies produce about 5 times more output per capita than their ancestors did 50 years ago. And their inflation-adjusted, or real per capita income, is about 5 times higher, perhaps not surprisingly. In essence, what these authors and researchers show is that countries where the government's role in the economy is limited and individuals are generally allowed to trade freely, everyone becomes better off. So a Christian economist reasons at least some of the inequality in income and wealth that we observe across nations is due to the inability to trade freely with others. As the video showed, we wouldn't get the smartphone without free trade. The appropriate response then is not income redistribution, it's to remove the obstacles. Obstacles to free trade are a violation of natural rights, or a justice problem. Foreign aid, which takes from some and gives to another, is a similar violation. The only appropriate response is more open trade or free markets. And as I said, my own experience and my direct empirical research found this to be true. For over 10 years now, I've been conducting empirical studies in microfinance for Christian groups such as Opportunity International and Hope International. Some of you may know them. I found that microfinance programs are significantly more successful when operated in a country with limited government involvement. This idea that we can improve the poor's living standards by giving them a small loan and helping them start a business works great as long as businesses can work great. When the government has a strong role in the economy, when it's hard to start a business, when it's hard to operate the business, microfinance, a true discipleship opportunity, a true gospel spreading opportunity, is hindered. One piece of broader evidence is when we look just at Bangladesh. Bangladesh is the home of the Grameen Bank. The bank's founder, Muhammad Yunus, won a Nobel Prize for getting microfinance started there. But nearly 40 years later, after he got it off the ground, the country is not much better off. The best hope for impoverished nations like Bangladesh is not more microfinance programs or other church programs that divvy out little small aid. It's better economic and political freedom. So in conclusion, this is when my students usually start picking up their backpacks. Dr. Johnson did. A libertarian political philosophy applied to economics is consistent with a Christian worldview. Since government intervention in the economy most often violates the natural or God-given rights of individuals. Since the free market works best to serve people, especially the poor, and since the biblical principles of justice can be served through markets, a Christian can be an economist, and an economist can be a libertarian, and a libertarian can be a Christian. Professor P.J. Hill of Wheaton College says that the Christian economist understands the fall. For this reason, we must study how creation in the image of God and the fall of man affect the study of human behavior. I say that the Christian libertarian economist has done such a study and understands that the fallen nature of man is evident in government as much as individuals. We conclude, we being Christian libertarian economists, conclude from this evidence that the decentralized decision-making of markets is the most just and virtuous economic system. As the Lord says in the first chapter of Isaiah, "Come now, let us reason together." With that, I thank you for coming, and I welcome your comments and questions.
Speed, we've got some time for questions. I saw a hand right there. Go ahead.
Please.
Yeah, could you comment on the libertarian view of freeloaders?
Freeloaders. The economic principle of free riding occurs when we have goods classified as public goods. That is, there are certain goods or services that the market itself wouldn't necessarily provide. The libertarian or the classical liberal doesn't think such goods actually exist. If we have strict enforcement of property rights, there is no commons. You might have heard the tragedy of the commons. There will be no commons. And the classical liberal thinker would argue, as Coase does, even if there was a commonplace, we could negotiate that ourselves as long as transaction costs would be low, which would be true in generally smaller communities. And so freeloaders or free riding shouldn't really exist if we have a good system of property rights.
How are you deriving property rights?
Property rights, good question. So how are they derived? There's quite a bit of debate in this. The property rights is, again, an identification of what I own or I have created or I have gained through trade. So it's an establishment in law that I know what I have done or what I have. So for property rights to be enforced and protected, that knowledge must be. It's most often difficult to do, hard to apply, with intangibles, like knowledge or ideas or inventions. But it's, again, not impossible, as long as we keep the negotiations efficient at low cost, as long as there's a sufficient judge. And the Christian libertarian often looks to the book of Judges as a model for that. Prior to when Samuel was told to anoint Saul, God told him what the kings and the government would do to the nation of Israel. And the model before them was simply the judge. The transaction cost for negotiating our differences, no matter how we thought we might be defining property rights, was very low. We were able to go to the judge, and the judge would interpret God's will in that particular transaction. So even with weak definitions of property rights, if we have low negotiating costs, we can still protect those property rights. Dr. Moore.
Well, I've been looking forward to your lecture, and I was very, very pleased. It definitely piqued my interest. I'm wondering, if you mentioned how Christianity has helped establish individual rights, and I'm also wondering how those would be related to, let's say, like the prophetic literature in the Old Testament, life and ministry of Jesus, serving the poor, the widow, the orphan, and just wondering how truly altruistic and golden rule-oriented free markets are. I guess I think of hospitals, for example, that they were started by Christians rather than private businesses seeking to make money, for example. So I guess I'm just kind of wanting to, how else does libertarianism connect with the wider Christian witness beyond individual rights?
Good. All right, so the question again is, how does Christian libertarianism view the wider individual rights and responsibilities given our faith, given our Judeo-Christian tradition?
And maybe more specifically, our Wesleyan heritage as well.
Okay. Don't ask me to go there. There's too many Wesleyans in the room that will find out what little I know. First, let me restate one thing that came up in your comments. Markets don't need to be altruistic. For markets to function well, altruism, greed, doesn't need to be the goal at all. Any purpose between two parties voluntarily agreeing to exchange can be served in the markets. So we don't have to have altruism in the markets. We don't have to have greed either. So any purpose can be served. So the Judeo-Christian tradition says that individuals have responsibilities to others in society, the poor included. But it further says that we are to show no partiality to the poor or the rich. But Jesus clearly served the poor. But he did so only upon their request. He never forcefully coerced anybody into healing. Further, he never asked that it be done corporately, that we gather together to somehow serve the poor, that we organize to serve the poor. He never asked of that. And the nation of Israel did so corporately. They gathered together at the storehouses, right? They tithed too in order to serve the needy. And they were to provide for the poor, to allow them to glean in the fields. Or, I got that right. It's the term of the side of the fields. Okay, and so there was responsibilities, but those were all individual responsibilities. It was the responsibility of that landowner. It was the responsibility of that household. It was never the responsibility of the state, the organized, coercive, aggressive rulers. So the Christian libertarian finds that to be the basis for their trust in libertarians and the trust in the markets. It's not that markets are necessarily going to provide that. Individuals are. And there's not necessarily a role for the state to do that.
As we look at history and the way businesses have run, what about if you don't regulate businesses, the best way to make money sometimes is to cheat. Well, and to use 5-year-olds in mines all day, never seeing the sun. I mean, I'm just speaking from what little I know of the history of industrialized nations before regulation. It's not a very pretty sight. And you can hope that individuals, but I mean, those 5-year-olds don't have a lot of transaction power or any of that. What if the businesses are outright treating people wrongly who have no power to oppose them?
Right.
What if they are, dumping all their contaminants into the river? It's a little late to sue them after so many creatures have died. You know what I'm saying? So how does that work?
Right. First, you're referring to a history, not all of history. In all of history, markets have served the poor the best. Markets have lifted far more out of poverty than have been put into poverty due to capitalism or markets. Now, does that mean there aren't cases like you bring up? Children working in the mines or working in sweatshops. Or even today, workers that might have been cheated out of wages due to them or discriminated against in particular options. But the libertarian sees that these actions are just as often produced by government regulation and government intervention in the economy. There's just as many cases of when government has shown partiality itself, favoring one industry or another, favoring one segment of the population. And in fact, many industries in history that could get away with employing children or skirting the rules is because of the political influence that they had in government. The corruption was in government that allowed the evils in the market.
That's not, you're saying we should not have government regulation. So libertarians would see a place for regulating to prevent some of these abuses or not?
Not necessarily regulating, but again, allowing the judicial system to correct those because they are violations of individual rights, particularly natural rights. Dr. Higgs.
How are you doing, Dr. Crabb?
I'm doing well. It's good to see you.
I'm very interested in the perception you hold of the relationship between constitutional law and natural or individual rights. Would you agree that constitutional law is an expression of typically a democracy to provide, among other benefits, opportunity? I think you argued that opportunity was one of those benefits that should come from some sort of regulation. Would you also agree that constitutional law is the basis for the judiciary system as opposed to an independent law-making body in and of itself?
Yes.
The state of Idaho has in its constitution that there should be a free and public education. Correct. It's also written in the Constitution that the University of Idaho, it's the only Idaho institution that's in the Constitution, that it should be a free, not tuition-driven institution. Therefore, it's the constitutional provision which provides opportunity, which limits the individual's freedom, because somebody has to pay for the free public education. Would you agree that that is a legitimate role of the elected officials in a constitutional democracy to limit the individual or natural rights of other individuals?
No. The Constitution should not limit the rights of any other individual.
Even in the form of providing opportunity.
You provide an opportunity, because in so doing, it's redistributing resources.
And paying for that opportunity.
Pardon me?
And to pay for that opportunity is a limiting of their rights.
Right.
Therefore, there would not be a public.
There should not be in the Constitution of the state of Idaho, nor as there isn't one in the Constitution of the United States. There's no Department of Education in the United States Constitution. And if the framers of the Idaho Constitution were following that, there would not be free education.
So what assurance would any citizen of the state of Idaho or from Mississippi in the 1960s have that the marketplace is providing equal opportunity?
There are no assurances in this world in our faith. There are no assurances of the government providing that opportunity. In fact, many would argue that the government is not providing that opportunity today. So there are no assurances from the market or otherwise to a right to education or even the opportunity to education. So I guess I'm not following why.
Well, I'm just trying to find out who's going to pay for education.
Why do we? There is a private market for education. Even if we structure ourselves as a nonprofit institution, we're participating in the market for education. Right. And so there will be without them. But education is not a natural right. We have the right to our life that we're created, and we have the right to that not be violated in our transaction. We have the right to use our resources that we've gained or have been given and voluntarily exchange it. But education is not necessarily a natural right.
Thank you.
Tom?
Yeah, I have a question that has to do with retributive justice and why.
I'm sorry, what?
With
Distributive
justice,
justice?
yeah, distributive justice, and why I think sometimes libertarian sorts of approaches, philosophy, seem to rub against some natural views we have of justice. Let's suppose that we have Chadwick here in Grant. We say they've got to run around Lake Lowell tonight. And before we go, we tape Chadwick's legs together and put 50 pounds on his back. And after about 2 hours of running, maybe 3, okay, say 10, Grant is coming back toward campus, and Chadwick barely at Lake Lowell. And then the libertarian comes up and sees the situation and says, so this isn't fair. Everyone should have equal rights here. And takes the tape off of Chadwick's legs, takes the pounds off, and lets him run free. But doesn't bring Grant all the way back to where Chadwick's at. Just lets him keep going because it's his right, given where he's at in the race, to keep going. That strikes a lot of people as unfair. So it seems like libertarians have to
Can I
answer.
tell you what's wrong with the thought experiment?
Yeah.
A libertarian wouldn't have looked at Chad and said, that's not fair. The libertarian said, Chadwick, that was stupid. Why'd you agree to do this in the first place?
Okay, but let's say
in your
that-
thought experiment, you coerced him.
Let's
He
say
didn't voluntarily agree to take that tape on and put the weight on his back.
All right, let's
You
take out the
coerced him.
voluntary stuff. Let's say this analogy is the same with Chadwick being born in India to a family in poverty and Grant is born in the United States to someone of wealth.
Okay.
So it's not a voluntary thing, it just happens to
Right.
be where they were
Yeah.
growing up in the world.
Right.
And now we say, you know what, we're not going to take anything away from the person in wealth and give it to the person in poverty, because that's taken away some of their rights and stuff. But it just doesn't seem fair that we wouldn't help someone who's at the lower end of things, because through no fault of their own, they happen to be born there.
And the Christian libertarian responds to that. Said, I'm going to help Chadwick. Grant, you're doing great. But I individually decided to do that. There's no role for the government to do that. Because when I bring in the government to do that, I must coerce everyone else in society to take from Grant and give to Chadwick. I become an aggressor. And Jesus was never an aggressor.
In 1996, when I was on sabbatical in Australia, something was featured on television that probably didn't make it in the United States. A number of Aboriginals from Australia went to the United Kingdom and planted a flag in England, claiming it for the Aboriginals.
Yes.
They said, what difference is that from what you did 2 centuries earlier? How would you answer that?
They were right. There is no difference. Colonialism was a violation of property rights. And it goes to the earlier question, how do we define property rights? And most libertarians would agree that their presence in that area was the definition of their property rights. Clearly, we violated it. What could have been done differently? Voluntary exchange with those individuals.
What do we do to remedy the situation that's created?
Yeah, to remedy becomes a different question, because then the role of the state requires aggression, again, to remedy. The Christian libertarian would say we don't need the state to do that. As Christians ourselves, we'll take on that responsibility. We don't need the state to coerce the rest of society to go along with us to help or to achieve that retribution. Still okay?
But I think you're giving we Christians way too much credit. You know, when Ron Sider wrote Rich Christians in a Hungry World 20, 30 years ago, the rich Christians were giving about 2.5% of their income to charity. When he rewrote the book 25 years later, the Christians were exponentially richer and were giving less than 2%. So, boy, if we were all as good as we ought to be and doing what Jesus was telling us to do, we probably still wouldn't be relevant to the global issue of poverty.
I think we could be.
Well, we could be, but
We've relied on the state to do our work now. We've relied on foreign aid. Oh, my taxes take care of that.
Well,
my
yeah.
taxes fund education, to get to Dr. Hagley's question. My taxes fund health care. Why should I give? Because we defaulted to the state. If the state got out of the way, perhaps we would go back to being as charitable as we should.
well, one probably won't know.
And we'll know. You're right. Chad?
So you were saying that it seems, you correct me if I'm wrong, that the libertarians still, you said, likes lawyers. And so
I didn't say we like them.
we tolerate lawyers.
We'll tolerate more in exchange for fewer wrongs. That's what the part they don't want.
Right. So the government could you call it a government that a libertarian would be okay with? Is more of a judiciary?
Very much so.
And then, so what are they legislating on?
They're interpreting law perhaps common law, or for the Christian, God's will and God's law. And so they're interpreting, and you can think of them more as arbitrary, keeping the negotiating costs between two parties that have a disagreement, keeping those negotiating costs low.
So what's an example of the common law? I mean, is this written? Is it what incorporates?
Yeah, what's worked in the past to settle such disagreements. So yes, the libertarian and classical liberal provide for a greater role of the judiciary than the other aspects of government.
So I hand over here.
So a great deal of the wealth of the world comes from natural resources, land, mineral, oil,
I disagree
gas.
with that, but I'll let you go on.
So who or what gives certain people the right to own those, the ownership of those, the property rights? Since your Christian background should tell you that things like the sabbatical year were created for the Israelites to sort of bring everything back to like the God-given distribution.
Right.
So how come the people who were born on top of the oil own the oil?
Yeah.
Isn't it natural?
Right. If we measure wealth by the gross domestic product, or even the value of the financial markets, such as the stock and bond, if you put the world stock and bond markets together, you have a world wealth of approximately 150 trillion, if I've got that right. I think so. And most of that is not because of resources. The primary source of wealth in the world is ideas. It's concepts. It's ways of producing things. That is the primary source of wealth. So, first of all, we disagree on the data with your question. Secondly, the property rights are established by creation, by God, where He placed us. And as was talked about before, we violated those rights over history, no question. So, is there a role for the state to fix that at this point? I'm not so sure, because it requires coercion. But if the state did follow libertarian and classic liberalism ideas, it would not. That action would stealing of those resources would be less likely to occur in the future.
George?
My Old Testament colleague is not here. I hope he's home working on his dissertation. But your reference to judges, I would suggest you do some revisioning there.
Okay.
Judges were basically charismatic leaders of militias. They were not those who determined justice. That was done by elders at the city gates. So it's really a kind of ad hoc government that becomes necessary when things go kaput that you have with the judges.
But would you agree that the process was negotiation?
No, it was killing people.
At least in some cases.
I'm actually interested in following up on that just a second.
Okay. Dennis?
Dennis, yeah. And that is...
Sorry, Kevin.
Kevin Dennis. No, it's right there. Go ahead, Kevin.
In what specific concrete ways do Christian libertarians depart from non-Christian libertarians?
That's a great question. That's one I can take away tonight and work on.
In other words, what difference does it make that you're a Christian libertarian?
The Christian libertarian comes to that political philosophy because of their belief in liberty and individual life, individual rights. From their moral philosophy, they are libertarians because they were Christians. They're not Christians because they were libertarians. And so they would differ, particularly from the group I mentioned, the anarchists. They would see a role for government in the protection of rights, where the anarchist sees no role for government at all. So there would be a difference between at least one group of libertarians. But that's a great question. I'll have to ponder it a little further.
So it does sound like there's a role of the government to protect our rights, and when the rights are infringed upon, there's a role to enforce the rights and to correct the injustice.
Correct.
And so I'm coming back to the notion of freeloading when people aren't participating in some of the shared expense of, for instance, just paying for the folks that are providing that freedom and the protection of our freedom. When they're not participating, and then we could go on to talk about if they're not participating in filling potholes in the road or something, that maybe we decided it's still practical to have public shared roads and so forth, then wouldn't it be the role of the government to say, you well, have to pay that?
No, it'd be the role to kill them.
Be the role well, not to kill them, but just
it could be. We're actually getting to some social questions that's beyond my economics but it could be. What you're discussing are high transaction costs, high negotiation costs. There needs to be, the judiciary needs to minimize the ability to bring that individual or those groups into cooperation. So what you're describing are the externalities that occur because there are high transaction costs.
And once you open
There's
that...
a question over here that I've got to have asked, or you're going to have a transaction cost later.
See, I won't let you talk at home about any of this. I really don't know about any of this.
I do get cut off.
Just following up with Kevin's question, does a libertarian platform then have a social platform? You know, are they gay marriage, abortion, some of those Republican versus Democrat issues? Yeah. Is there one way or the other they fall?
Yeah. Boaz's book, The Primer, describes this well. On the spectrum of social issues, the libertarian is quite liberal. On the economic spectrum, they're quite conservative. So we differ from both parties on those two spectrums. The libertarian would not have an issue with gay marriage because the libertarian says the state has no role in marriage at all. That there is no need for the state to recognize marriage. And I would argue that the gay marriage issue right now is primarily an economic one. Gay couples want to be recognized by the state so that they can share the entitlements that come from the state. And so I believe that's what motivates them.
But as a Christian,
that's
certainly not true.
Right.
So would
So
you say that's a difference between Christian libertarians versus non-Christian?
I'm not sure if
I don't even want to ask your opinion right out.
It's a good question because the Christian libertarian would simply say there's no role for the state in there. As a Christian, I have a role. I have a role to teach them about Jesus in love and teach them the morality of Jesus in a loving manner. Same with abortion or any of those others. So I have an individual responsibility. The Christian libertarian simply, that's not the responsibility of the state. The state has no responsibilities, according to the libertarian. We have responsibilities. The state has none. Mr. Thompson.
It seems to me there's two reasons why the libertarians are going to be fighting a losing battle.
It's not malicious?
Number one, power corrupts.
A libertarian agrees.
Number two, the majority is always wrong.
In democracy. And what you're actually...
I'm not sure it's limited to democracy.
It may not be. But what you're actually bringing up is an idea from Robert Nozick, the philosopher that I brought up about modern libertarians. He actually does not like democracy. And he has an interesting parable called The Tale of the Slave that describes certain stages of slavery. And democracy is the final one. That we're actually in slavery to the majority. And so the pure libertarian would agree with you that in democracy the majority will enslave or violate the rights of others. So it's a political philosophy. It's hard to get to the full. It's not necessarily a utopia. But Nozick thought that libertarianism was the utopia of utopias, if we could ever get there. That's right.
One more question, and we're going to pull it to a close.
Well, it seems like you've opened the door, though, to having forced taxation in order to pay for certain kinds of expenses that would be unjust not to pay.
Such as?
Well, like the cost of the military providing protection of our freedoms.
I didn't say that the state had to do that. The only thing I
doesn't
did...
the state provide the justice system?
Yeah, that's national defense.
Isn't there a cost associated with providing justice?
That people could negotiate outside of the state to provide.
And when they don't, isn't it unfair and unjust? When certain individuals don't, it seems like there's a room for the government then to step in and force them
to. There's an assumption behind your question that you've defined the boundaries around a group of people. The libertarian defines the boundaries around one. So I can have a national defense of the 4x4 space that I'm standing in. And I can have lots of rifles, which maybe I should be buying now, to protect this space, to do it. So you define the national defense quite large. So when you defined nation, you already defined a government of people that got together for that purpose, and they did so voluntarily. But that doesn't necessarily have to be true. You're 4 steps down the road. When you said national defense, you implied there was a nation, which is a group of people that have already formed for perhaps the purpose of defense.
Yeah, people would probably get together and decide that's a good idea.
And that's fine if they do so voluntarily.
And then when some of the individuals of that group decide not to
but that
participate
state cannot then force that on somebody else, such as the Aboriginals in Australia.
All right, we're going to pull this to a close. I've got 2 things for you. One of them is a thank you check. We're very proud of you for that. But the other one is actually a medallion. It's inside here, and you can take this and you can wear it with your academic medallion in recognition of your speaking to this group and your participation in the Centennial year. Thanks, Pete. Congratulations.
Thank you.